The live is started. Sergeant, can you start your recording?
Cloud recording is good. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's remote New York City Council hearing of the Committee on Consumer and Worker Protection. At this time, would all panelists please turn on your videos? To minimize disruption, please place electronic devices to vibrate or silent. If you wish to submit testimony, you may send it to testimony@council.nyc.gov. Again, that's testimony@council.nyc.gov. Thank you for your cooperation. Chair, we are ready to begin. Chair, you're muted.
It looks like I pressed mute and unmute at the same time you guys were unmuting me. So let me go back to where we were. Thank you for joining our oversight hearing today and before the Council's Committee on Consumer and Worker Protection. First, I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues who are present. I see Councilmember Moya here. And now to my opening statement. And so, good morning. I am Councilmember Marjorie Velasquez, Chair of the Committee on Consumer and Worker Protection, and I'd like to welcome you to our oversight hearing today on consumer protections during the COVID-19 pandemic. The purpose of our oversight hearing today is to examine the successes and challenges the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, or DCWP, had in responding to complaints of price gouging during the initial stages of the pandemic, and to hear about the lessons learned and the changes that the agency will be making forward as it continues to enforce price gouging regulations. One of the most visceral moments of the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020 was the rush to buy personal protective equipment, PPE, from masks to hand sanitizer and disinfectant wipes. Certain businesses in New York City sought to exploit this panic and dramatically increase the price of these essential goods to try and profit off the COVID-19 crisis. DCWP took immediate action, declaring these items in short supply to prevent stores from selling these items at unreasonably high prices. DCWP eventually enacted a permanent rule which made price gouging illegal for any products or services essential to health, safety, and welfare during a declared state of emergency. As of November 9th, 2020, DCWP announced it had issued over 15,000 violations since March 5th, 2020. DCWP also found that the neighborhoods with the most complaints of price gouging are many of the same neighborhoods that were hardest hit by COVID-19. These neighborhoods, which are majority Black and Latinx, had a median income of approximately $30,000. While we are hopefully rounding the corner of the pandemic, it is important to highlight that these same communities that were devastated with the highest number of COVID cases and the highest levels of unemployment and business closures, and residents in these neighborhoods were also experiencing extreme levels of price gouging. I want to thank the tireless work of DCWP, who received and investigated thousands of complaints of price gouging. City residents experiencing price gouging, where a single face mask can cost $30, were unable to buy them. Within this context, the enforcement of price gouging laws during the pandemic were essential in ensuring that the safety and health of city residents are inspected. The controller audit also found that DCWP never created a timeline standards for how long it expected an investigation to start after the agency received a complaint. I have concerns about the amount of time it took the agency to respond to complaints. DCWP conducted inspections in response to about 28% of the price gouging complaints it received, and those inspections occurred on average 43 days after the complaints were received. In 16% of the cases, it was more than 90 days after the receipt. I understand DCWP objects the controller's conclusion that 16% of cases were resolved over 90 days after they received the complaint, and I look forward to a productive conversation today to try and solve this unresolved disagreement between the agency and the controller. As the pandemic continued to plague New York, price gouging has shifted to other consumer health products. For example, certain stores drastically increased the price of at-home COVID tests. A deli in Manhattan was found to be selling a 2-pack of an at-home COVID rapid test for $80, while the retail price of this test is typically $24. In response, Attorney General Tish James announced a consumer alert concerning price gouging for COVID tests. And I look forward to hearing whether DCWP investigated complaints related to price gouging for COVID tests and the ways in which the agency has worked with the AG's office on this issue. There have also been issues with COVID-19 pop-up testing sites failing to fulfill their advertised 24 to 48-hour turnaround time in tests. AG James has issued warnings to certain companies failing to meet their promised turnaround times, but I look forward to hearing how DCWP is working to protect consumers' rights on this as well. The controller's audit provides lessons learned for DCWP, and our conversation today will highlight how the agency changed its internal procedures to better enforce the price gouging rule, both to comply with the recommendations of the controller and to adopt changes in what goods and services are being price gouged. With that said, I'd like to thank myself, central staff team, Senior Counsel Stephanie Jones, Senior Policy Analyst Noah Mexler and Leah, and my Chief of Staff, Nick Rollison, and Deputy Chief of Staff, Alex Anderson, for their hard work today. I also would like to take a moment to recognize Councilmember Ose. Back to you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Chair. I am Stephanie Jones, Counsel to the Committee on Consumer and Worker Protection, and I will be moderating this hearing today. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that you will be on mute until you are called on to testify, at which point you will be unmuted by the host. During the hearing, I will be calling on panelists to testify. Please listen for your name to be called, as I will periodically be announcing who the next panelist will be. At this hearing, we will first be inviting testimony from the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, followed by testimony from members of the public. During the hearing, if council members would like to ask a question of the administration or a specific panelist, please use the Zoom raise hand function and I will call on you in order. For all panelists, when called to testify, please state your name and the organization you represent, if any. Before we continue, Chair, I believe we have some council members who have joined us.
I'd like to recognize Councilmember Botcher and Councilmember Brewer.
Thank you, Chair. We will now call representatives of the administration to testify. We will be hearing testimony from Vilda Vera Mayuga, Commissioner of the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection. We will also be joined for questions by Stephen Atanani, Executive Director for External Affairs at DCWP, and Michael Tiger, Deputy General Counsel at DCWP. At this time, I will administer the affirmation. Administration panelists, please raise your right hands and I will call on each of you individually to respond. To affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth before this committee, and to respond honestly to council member questions. Commissioner Mayuga?
I do.
Thank you. Executive Director Atanani?
I do.
Thank you. Deputy General Counsel Tiger?
I do.
Thank you. This time, I'd like to invite Commissioner Mayuga to present her testimony.
Thank you. Muy buenos días, estimados concejales. Good morning, Chair Velázquez and council members. It is my pleasure to see you all again so soon. Today, as you heard, I am joined by two members of my senior staff, Steve Etanani and Michael Tiger. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. We all know, as you mentioned, Chair Velázquez, the pandemic had an immeasurable impact on the health, well-being, and economic lives of New Yorkers. All of us have felt its effects, whether directly or through our family and friends. New Yorkers have sustained these burdens courageously, and our city will continue to do its utmost to support them through this pandemic and beyond. From the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, DCWP recognized the economic impact that New Yorkers were facing as consumers. And as such, on March 5th, 2020, we declared certain goods in short supply. And later that month, we promulgated an emergency rule prohibiting price gouging. We have since made that rule permanent to prohibit price gouging of goods and services that are essential to the health, safety, and welfare of New Yorkers during states of emergency. Now, it will always be hard to put into words what those early months of the pandemic were like for New Yorkers. Each of us has a different story to tell, and at DCWP, in that first 2-month period alone, our story was told through the more than 9,200 complaints we received from New Yorkers of instances of price gouging. That is a 220% increase over total complaints received by the agency for that same period of 2019. Let me be clear, price gouging during the state of emergency was an egregious exploitation of a situation of fear and uncertainty that consumers found themselves in. DCWP research shows that price gouging was most prevalent in the neighborhoods hardest hit by the pandemic, which also tended to be our city's communities of color. Some examples of price gouging include Lysol spray cans for $12 each, 8-ounce bottles of hand sanitizer for $30 each, and boxes of face masks for $200 each. Prices like this had real impact on the lives of our seniors, our essential workers, and our vulnerable families. We rapidly stood up intake processes for price gouging complaints, shifted vital enforcement resources, springing into action on behalf of New Yorkers, which resulted in conducting 3,000 inspections and issuing 14,000 charges for price gouge items. And because of our enforcement, consumer education, and our partnerships with elected officials, price gouging has decreased considerably, creating a fairer marketplace for New Yorkers seeking a just recovery. As we looked into the devastation of the pandemic, we found that certain communities in New York City were disproportionately impacted. New Yorkers were more likely to face unemployment during the pandemic if they were younger, women, had lower educational attainment, or were Black or Hispanic. This impacts the financial health of New Yorkers, and our financial empowerment centers have historically been a key resource for New Yorkers. We've recently announced that since 2008, our financial counseling and coaching has been able to help clients reduce their debt by $85 million and build savings by $10 million. And in response to the pandemic, DCWP rapidly adjusted its financial empowerment resources to support our community's financial needs. Financial empowerment centers effectively provided telephonic counseling and assistance with benefit eligibility, such as the New York State Department of Labor's Excluded Workers Fund and other emergency housing and food resources. Through New York City Free Tax Prep, we expanded remote offerings, completed 140,000 returns, saved $17.5 million in fees, and helped New Yorkers claim their economic impact payments. And now, looking toward the future, it will be essential to support Mayor Adams' priorities regarding the Earned Income Tax Credit. It is one of the most effective poverty reduction programs in history. We need to increase the city's matching rate to up to 30%, and we need the state to increase its investment. This will have a transformative effect on the lives and financial health of hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers. And we all need to work with our state elected colleagues to get this over the finish line. And let me say just how important our relationship with you all, the council, is. Our ability to protect New Yorkers from exploitative and deceptive price gouging is grounded in our authority under our foundational law, New York City's Consumer Protection Law. Just last summer, DCWP worked with the council to modernize the CPL and strengthen its essential role in protecting New Yorkers from deception and other unconscionable practices. We stood up stronger rights for consumers who complete their transactions in languages other than English, and we boosted protections for consumers engaging in online transactions. Lastly, I must highlight the other significant work done by this agency over the past 2 years, ensuring worker protections during COVID-19 and consumer protection investigations that were not directly tied to the COVID-19 pandemic. These efforts occurred at the same time as our price gouging enforcement and financial empowerment efforts. And we're also of great priority for the agency during the pandemic. They brought substantial outcomes for New Yorkers, meaning that since 2020, we have secured close to $6 million in restitution in our worker protection cases and tens of millions of dollars in debt relief for New Yorkers. Throughout the pandemic, we have remained steadfast in our mission to protect and enhance the economic lives of New Yorkers across a range of activities. And as always, we are eager to work closely with the Council on additional ways to support New Yorkers. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions and our discussions.
Thank you, Chair. I'll turn it over to you.
I'd like to recognize Councilmember Menon, who has joined us, as well as Councilmember Krishnan. And I'd like to turn it over to Councilmember Moya for his opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Velasquez. Good morning. I'm Councilmember Francisco Moya. I'm Chair of the Subcommittee of COVID Recovery and Resiliency. Thank you again to Chair Velasquez for holding this important hearing, and to all my colleagues who have joined us today. COVID hasn't just forced us to adjust our way of life, but it has consistently reminded us of the disparities that continue to impact minority and vulnerable communities. Access to much needed resources became a challenge at the onset of COVID. It became a real life game of who knew what website to check or where to go to be able to have the things that we needed to protect ourselves. If it wasn't access to testing at the beginning of the pandemic, and many of us witnessed the long lines in neighborhoods like mine and at Elmhurst Hospital, it was access to masks, it was access to vaccines early on, and it was access to testing kits during the surge of Omicron. It was access to hand sanitizers or disinfectant wipes and even toilet paper. And we saw these issues of access over and over. It's a stark difference between neighborhoods that were just minutes apart from mine. That's why I pushed for data for the prioritization of zip codes, because my neighborhoods and Black, Latino, immigrant communities, the very communities that I represent, were being left behind. And to add to these issues, the bad actors who only sought to put profit over people's desperate need to protect their lives and loved ones, bad practices always end up hurting our communities the worst. And if bad actors know that they can get away with it, they will continue to do it. Case in point, price gouging. We need to ensure that whatever rules and laws we have in place to protect New Yorkers have real teeth, so that we can truly enforce and begin and bring accountability. So I want to thank the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection who's present here today on this hearing, and I look forward to a very lively discussion. Thank you, Chair Velasquez, for allowing me to join the committee today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. I'll now turn it back over to Chair Velasquez to ask questions of the administration. Panelists, please stay unmuted if possible during this question and answer period. Thank you. Chair?
Good morning once again, and thank you. Thank you for coming out to this very important oversight hearing, because it's definitely impacted communities like mine and Councilmember Moya's very significantly. And we want overall to make sure that we're working for our communities, not just now, but we're setting a precedent for the future. So with that, I'd like to ask the following. How many total complaints and inspections did DCWP carry out in relation to enforcing its price gouging rule?
Sure, thank you, Chair. We had in 2020, we had a total of 12,421 complaints. In comparison, which I think is, obviously nobody likes price gouging, but we're very proud to say that then in 2021, that number dropped significantly to 191. And that's, those are the numbers for the complaints. Sorry, did I miss a second part of the question?
So, and how about 2022?
Oh, 2022, we've had 7 so far.
Okay, that's a good way to start the year off.
I know, we want to keep it that way.
Let's keep it down, but and I guess my concern is also when is it specifically the inspections after that? How many were that specifically in enforcing these price gouging rule?
Absolutely. So in terms of inspections in 2020, we had a total of 3,191. And in 2021, that's 111. 2022, 5.
And what, any violations that came out of that, or what came out of that? What was the outcomes?
In 2020, we had 13,288. 2021, 1,038. We don't have any charges yet for 2022, or at least I don't have the number here, I apologize. But in terms of summonses, we have 1,004 for 2020, 2021, 72, and 1 in 2022.
Thank you for that. And now, what % of these inspections occurred in the communities hardest hit by the pandemic? Kind of like Councilmember Moya had said, we had the zip codes. Have we taken a look at those zip codes and compared it to the number of inspections done in those communities?
Don't know that I have it by borough. I don't have it by zip code, but it certainly, reflects some of our concerns in other areas of work. I mean, related to the economic health of our New Yorkers. Generally we do a lot of that research in our financial, through our financial empowerment centers and that line of work. So it does reflect, pre-pandemic, it didn't change during the pandemic, the areas where we saw individuals hit the highest. The highest numbers were in terms of complaints and inspections were in Brooklyn, followed by Queens, followed by Manhattan, followed by Bronx. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm looking at a chart making sure.
And in general, as the commissioner alluded to, our complaint data tracks with where the inspections were. So where we got the most complaint data, in this case Brooklyn, we also inspected the most in Brooklyn.
Okay. Now, when DCWP announced the emergency rule on price gouging, was the agency prepared to receive these tens of thousands of complaints that did come through?
Thank you for that question, Chair. I think, pandemic obviously was unprecedented, that none of us planned to get such a high volume of complaints. We certainly did our best. We're certainly very proud of the work and what we've accomplished just by looking at the numbers that went down so dramatically in terms of receiving price gouging complaints. We were similarly impacted like the rest of New Yorkers in terms of our teams and some of our staff also suffering from COVID. And so that impacted how many people, right? I mean, when we were out conducting these inspections. But we did quickly identify the way to really put structure in place to address the complaints that were coming in. I'm going to actually have a Deputy General Counsel give you a little bit more detail. He was here and going through it all and can probably answer better so you can have all the information.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Chair. I was here. For better, for worse, and it was a trying time for obviously everyone in the city, and it was our particular challenge to deal with this issue that fell right into our strike zone. But I just want everyone to understand, as a first note, we didn't have a price gouging rule before the COVID-19 emergency. So we began to get complaints in, say, February, early March 2020, and there was no price gouging rule on the books. So we had to consider first, how are we going to deal with the intake of hundreds and thousands of complaints? And we adjusted our intake in our Consumer Services Division to deal with that. We had to consider how are we going to respond to those complaints? We had to consider how to allocate enforcement resources. I apologize for any sound in the background. Unfortunately, there is some noise going on outside our building. We had to consider how to allocate efficiently and proactively our enforcement resources to get to the communities that were most impacted by these complaints. And we had to figure out how we deal with them on a legal basis. Because I said, we didn't actually have a rule before the pandemic. We did have this short supply rule, which, Chair, you referenced in your opening statement, that was very limited. We dusted it off, and that only dealt with things that the commissioner could declare in short supply. To declare something in short supply, we had to send inspectors and members of City Hall staff out to all 5 boroughs to prove that face masks, disinfectant wipes truly were in short supply. And that rule was time limited. It would only last for 60 days. So we knew, given where we were standing in February 2020, March 2020, that was not going to be a sufficient tool to deal with the issue that was befalling New York City consumers. So we thought quickly, we thought efficiently, we dealt with the operational challenges that I mentioned before, and we promulgated that emergency rule, I believe on March 15th, which was only 3 days after Mayor de Blasio declared a state of emergency in the city of New York. That rule was limited to those products and services regarding the diagnosis, prevention, and treatment of COVID-19. So because it had to be done in that limited way, because it had to be done on an emergency basis, it didn't go through the usual rulemaking process, so it had to be limited. Under the terms of emergency rule, you can't have it as an emergency forever. So by June of 2020, we passed a permanent rule that was forward-looking. We had now had the experience of dealing with price gouging in an emergent basis, in a true emergency for this city. And we thought, how can we deal with this going forward in future states of emergency? And that's that permanent rule in June 2020 that applies to all states of emergency going forward. But I do note that for our price gouging powers to exist, there does have to be a state of emergency in the city of New York. It's not a generalized prohibition on increasing prices in the city. There has to be a state of emergency. And the price gouging enforcement has to be connected to the underlying state of emergency. So I know that was a lot of talking, but I just wanted to give that sort of overview to the committee about the work we did under that sort of very concentrated time frame. And I must say, we're proud of the work we did because, as the commissioner alluded to, the number of complaints went down during 2020 and into 2021. So we think the steps that we took early on in the pandemic did bear fruit for consumers.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think one of my concerns is when we're going back to, I understand it was an emergency order and then it became a permanent rule, but do you feel that the agency had adequate staffing at that time period, and what the recommendation is looking forward to when it is another emergency, God forbid, but we still have to consider if there is another state of emergency, do you find that you have sufficient staffing to properly enforce this price gouging rule?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Totally, I really understand the question and the concern. I hesitate to give you a definitive answer in the sense that I don't know what the next emergency may look like. I don't, I really don't, right? I mean, just like the pandemic and COVID, it was hard to tell. But I will say, we do feel better prepared in the sense that we now have this permanent rule on the books that we can activate and know, have a process. Having gone through it, like thrown into it and having to figure it out so quickly, we now have a process in place that we feel comfortable would adequately, position us to address price gouging, if that's what comes next.
Now, going back, and let's start off with the controller's audit, right? That's where I have a lot of concerns, and I'd love to hear more about what lessons can we learn from this audit, right? So, why did DCWP not create these protocols, all right? So we found so for folks that don't know, the controller audit found that the agency did not formalize written protocols for how the General Counsel Division should prioritize which complaints lead to inspections. So now going back to the original question, why did DCWP not create these protocols?
Well, I think, again, it was the pandemic that threw us, in the middle of not expecting something that was unprecedented. But we did have protocols. I believe the controller's report was about formalizing in writing those protocols. We did follow certain procedures that we did have in place and could draw upon in terms of our experience with handling complaints generally. So we are in the process. We're not disputing the report from the controller, and really welcome their feedback, just like, we will welcome yours or any consumer or business that we work with. So we are in the process of reducing to writing those protocols to make sure that we have them for the hopefully never, but probably likely next emergency.
So you alluded to the fact that there were some guidelines. Do we understand what was prioritized in those guidelines? Is there something that we can defer back to, and how can we implement this now going forward?
Sure. I'll ask again our Deputy General Counsel, Mike Tiger. He's in our counsel's office and can walk you through those protocols that we generally follow and that we did implement during the pandemic and will tailor to an emergency moving forward.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Chair. It's a good question. To be clear and to underscore what the Commissioner said, the control report did not find that we lacked these protocols entirely. Rather, it said that we should memorialize those protocols, which there was no dispute we created at the onset of the pandemic, so that they can be referred to in future emergencies. And I think it's reflected in the public documents, the way the control report, I think it's referred to in actually the controller's audit report itself, but it also attaches the agency's response. And in that agency response, it lays out the different criteria that the General Counsel Division used to prioritize complaints as they came in for inspection, including their location, what the egregiousness of the complaint, whether there were multiple complaints. There are a set of criteria that are laid out in that document. And those are the criteria that we are now in the process of memorializing in a written protocol that will be used in future states of emergencies.
I like to hear that we're doing that, but the audit did conclude that without written protocols, DCWP may have hindered in ensuring the businesses posing greater risk for price gouging were identified and expected. Do you agree with this assessment?
Thank you, Chair. I guess maybe I read it differently. We didn't see it as a controversial audit, from the controller. We really understood the necessity of them looking into how we handle the large number, right, of complaints that came in. But we are comfortable in that, we really tackled it, and we substantially reduced the number of price gouging complaints that came in. We did follow a protocol similar to what we do for other, complaints, intake complaints, the intake process of complaints that can come in generally under, the many things that we do with the over 50 licenses or, industries that we license and things like that. So I didn't read it that way, in terms of suggesting that there was something that we didn't do correctly. Sure, I think we can always do things better, like in anything, not just the price gouging issue. We are constantly looking at what should we be changing. It's part of what we do as a matter of process here together, oftentimes together with you, right? Because certain things might need a change in the books, what the books say. The enactment of the permanent rule that we can then go back to. So I'm not concerned. I think we did have a process. We've learned from it also in terms of it being specific to a pandemic, large number of complaints, and that's what we're memorializing now in writing. Do you want to add anything, Steve?
Yeah, sure. I think what's indisputable is that our price gouging efforts were a success, and the proof is with the dissipating number of complaints, the outreach and education we did above and beyond what local law tells us to do in terms of language access and meeting consumers and New Yorkers where they are. But I think, and as the Commissioner is alluding to, our agency already has general guidelines as to what precipitates an inspection when we receive a complaint. Mike outlined a couple of those things, whether the recency of the complaint, whether it's actionable for us to actually go out to do so. We also receive multiple complaints for a particular business. So that also informs kind of the delta between complaints and inspections that we highlighted earlier in our testimony and question and answer. We had over 12,000 complaints, for example, but above 3,000 inspections. That's not because we weren't prepared to handle all the complaints that came in. That's more of us going through our processes and procedures to ensure that we are going out and using our staff members' time strategically and effectively to get to the results that we achieved, which was, flooding the zone in a sense and making sure that New Yorkers and businesses knew that price gouging was unacceptable and that this wasn't going to stand in our city given the times.
I think going back to this audit, the audit did find that DCWP never established productivity or timeline measures with regard to its enforcement of the price gouging rule. Is there an explanation as to why the agency did not produce these timeline measures?
You mean in terms of how long it took from receipt of a complaint to go out to do an inspection?
Mm-hmm.
I think it goes back to the large influx of the complaints that we received during that short period of time. It honestly presented, we put it in our response to the audit, our Herculean efforts to overcome challenges to address the number of complaints that came in. And again, just to be honest, it's our own team, we weren't exempt from the effects of COVID and staff, falling ill to COVID itself and having other challenges like that. However, I do think that, again, the best performance measure is looking at the amount of complaints that came in then and that came after we started enforcing. I mean, it's such a dramatic drop in the number of complaints that it really, that is to me the true testament of the success story of our putting into place a process to address an issue that we found incredibly egregious and taking advantage of New Yorkers in a time of desperation, unprecedented times of need. And that really showed that what we did, despite nobody ever thinking that anything had to be done, and creating a law in the books, an emergency rule, and really moving things around to be most effective, tackled it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but basically I just think that there's a number of factors we're going to be looking in, and at least half of our inspections did happen within 28 days of receiving a complaint, and over 70% we did do them within the 50 days. But we couldn't really predict what were the things we were going to be looking at and how things were going to go about when we launched these efforts and reacted to the unprecedented pandemic. But certainly, now with the background and the experience that we have, we're going to set up our timeframes and just understand that we would want to, at the same time, remain nimble, right, and flexible, because that's what we do. Depending on the industry, depending on the issue, depending on the matter, we have to be able to adjust. And the main purpose for us is going to be, how do we stop it from happening? And that is what we did here. We stopped the price gouging from happening. Consumers understood and businesses understood. I think everybody now knows very well, both businesses and consumers, what is it about prices. And if there's a question about it, they will call us internally, we can address it. And again, just no better numbers to look at than the number of complaints coming in now versus what came then.
And we're in the process of implementing the recommendations that the controller identified. I think that can't be lost here. But what also can't be lost is that you cannot divorce the work that we were doing from the times that we were in. We were legitimately, so to speak, building this plane while flying it as well, in the interest of protecting New Yorkers. And I think the controller himself recognized that by saying that the agency went through incredible hardships to safeguard New Yorkers from unscrupulous profiteers. That speaks for itself and is a reflection of the hard work that this agency did during that time.
I guess going back to the timing piece, how long did it take the agency on average to investigate a business after receiving a complaint?
Well, I think in our response, we quoted, we alluded to between 0 to 28 days. That's about half of the complaints. That's the amount it took in about half of the complaints.
So you said 0 to 28 days?
Yes.
So the controller had found that in about 16% of the cases, DCWP took over 90 days to investigate a complaint. And then DCWP objected to this figure, but failed to provide the controller with the relevant evidence to back its claim. So now, does the agency still maintain that this figure is incorrect? And if so, will you share the evidence with my office to prove that 16% of the cases did not take over 90 days to investigate?
So I don't think we have that specific data here. We certainly can work with your staff to address any concerns. My concern is that we were successful. I don't, it's like it wasn't, I don't want to get, stuck on a dispute about what percentage took to address the number of complaints, because again, it was unprecedented. We set it up, we addressed the issue. We haven't received, I guess, complaints about the process, in terms of we believe that our New Yorkers understood and learned from it with us. And that's the measure of success that we're seeing. But we can certainly, reach out and get back to your staff on more specific, more granular numbers.
And I do want to mention that, as the commissioner said, we don't find this to be a particularly controversial audit. There isn't, a dispute with the comptroller's office beyond what was written in our response. And I think, like I said, the comptroller recognizes the work that was done in the context of the times that we were in. I think that really just cannot be emphasized enough in this hearing and as we discuss this work going forward.
Definitely. And to me, it's concerning in that what lessons can we learn, right? It was a tough period for all. And certainly the biggest concern is the most affected communities, the most vulnerable communities were taken advantage of. And so keeping that in mind, we really need to make sure that as we're writing these protocols, as we're following it, as we're making it more permanent, that we're keeping those folks in mind. Those are my seniors. That is my community. That is Councilmember Moya's community. And so it is deeply personal for us to make sure we're getting this right and that we're working together. And certainly the audit really does shed some light. And I think it's this opportunity that we can grow together and make sure that we're properly staffing, we're properly educating not only ourselves and the council, the agency, but more importantly, our communities, and making sure that we're all advocates and we're all in this together, especially against those bad actors who choose to take advantage of us and our community and set a bad precedent, not only for ourselves, but for the city. So we're in this together, but we're gonna do this to make sure that we understand where can we collaborate and move forward. And so this today is important and vital. And so a couple more questions, and then I'm gonna pass it on to Councilmember Moya, who was also, his community was really greatly affected. And so I'll turn it over to him in a couple more questions. So DCWP, back to your inspections. And you mentioned earlier that you selected a couple and it went through testing, and that's why you went over to 28%. So can you explain to me again why 28% of price gouging complaints were inspected, and why was the agency only investigating nearly a third of what it received as complaints?
Sure. So I'll probably pass it to Deputy General Counsel in a little bit, but just I think what's important to note is that you do get a number of complaints that may all be related to the same business. So not every complaint is going to result in an inspection visit, because you could really literally get hundreds about the same business, for example. And that's one measure, going back to like factors that you look into that we're going to be paying attention to. Unfortunately, we also did get a number of complaints that were not what we would call actionable. We didn't get all the information we would necessarily need from consumers to be able to turn that into an inspection. So those are generally some of the things that we find that I'm glad you asked that question, because I do think it's important to add that other context. It kind of goes along, hand in hand with what you mentioned, Chair, that we very much agree with you in terms of making sure that our communities, especially those that are most vulnerable, are well educated so that when they see something, they know what exactly we're going to need for them to bring to us. And so it's all, it's all encompassing. And so after we do this whole hearing and everything, we shouldn't forget, like you said, right? It happened. It could happen again. So what is the best way to effectively communicate with our communities? Again, especially those that are most vulnerable, that are not going to be like, oh, let me go to the DCWP website, right? I mean, how do we get to them in a language they understand, not just actual language, but the words that are used, the vocabulary that we use to make sure that they understand what is it that we need, what should they be looking out, and let us then come and do our piece to be effective. But having said that, Mike.
Good. Thank you, Commissioner. I mean, I think we're very proud. I just want to underscore again of the work we stood up. As my colleague Steve said, we were building the aircraft as we were flying it. But we have to think strategically about how we allocate our non-infinite resources in a time of true emergency for all New Yorkers, including the people that were working at this agency. And I do want to level set that there's no world where we would have been able to address every single price gouging complaint that was coming in. So we had to think strategically how we were going to get the biggest bang for our buck for our enforcement resources. And so it does matter what the egregiousness of a complaint, how much they were charging, whether we were hearing repeat violations or repeat complaints from certain locations, where in the city those locations were. These are all things that we did consider. It is true there was a lot of sort of maybe noise in the data that we're talking about here, because there might be locations that received multiple complaints. So we have 4 complaints for one location that would result in one inspection. Or at times, remember at the beginning when I was sort of unpacking the chronology of what we did, we had those short supply rules. Those only apply to certain products. So for a while, we couldn't respond to certain complaints about certain very important products until we realized that what we had was insufficient to deal with the breadth of the emergency and why we passed the emergency price gouging rule. So at different times in chronology, there were times we couldn't respond to every single complaint. But I do want to underscore that we tried to think this through as well as we could at the time, given the emergent circumstances, in a strategic way, as we do with all our enforcement operations, we do with responding to consumer complaints in the normal course for all the different categories that were within our jurisdiction.
Thank you for that. Can you describe any lessons that the agency has learned from the audit?
Chair, we don't dispute them. So I think in terms of lessons, we understand the value of written protocols, and that's, what we're in the process of doing. We understand the value in having certain performance measures. We still, we had things that we took from experience in handling many other types of complaints. So I'm not really sure we could have had the written protocols for price gouging specifically before, but the audit, was a good exercise, certainly, to look at that specific area and help us be better prepared and better positioned for any future emergency.
Got it. I want to recognize Councilmember Abreu, who has joined us. He joined us earlier, but I was in the middle of super focused questions and I failed to recognize him. So I'm recognizing him now. And I'm actually turning over my questions right now to Councilmember Moya.
Thank you, Chair Velasquez. Good morning, Commissioner. Just a couple of questions. I'm not going to take up too much of your time. Can you just tell me, what is the number of inspectors that you have in total?
We have 63 inspectors on the field.
And that's year-round?
That's for all of our, yes, that's year round for all of the areas that we cover in terms of jurisdiction-wise, yes.
Okay, but are they like, out of the 60, they all go out to do the same work, or are they specific to certain issues that you cover as an agency?
Some of them specialize in certain areas, and then we'll have others, the specialized supervisors, who may be going across different areas of the enforcement work.
Okay, so 60, but then they go individually to, the different programs that are relevant to their field. Got it. So just a couple of questions. What was the follow-up with the businesses after they were issued a violation? So in other words, were there a follow-up inspection, calls to ensure that there wasn't any repeat violations afterwards?
Thank you for that, council member. The way that we did the violations, the inspector goes out, they'll issue a summons. That summons is addressed through the process at oath. So it would, our inspectors would then be called to testify at those hearings to determine close basically the case, depending on what oath finds.
Right, but that was it. So it would end at oath. There was never any follow-up inspection to see if they were repeating the violation.
Violating the law again? Let me ask my team here to make sure I don't give you the wrong information.
Yeah, so thank you, council member, for the question. I think, again, I don't want to, I can't overstate the time that we were in. So if you're speaking about outreach to businesses in general, we do a number of different tactics and ways for us to connect with businesses to educate them on laws and rules that effectuate them. That includes on-the-ground outreach, business education days, webinars, things of that nature. But price gouging, and in the time period of March 2020 and the subsequent months during the height of COVID, there were naturally less on-the-ground educational methods that we had. But we did.
Let me.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, council member. Let me just. I think. Look, as we mentioned before, and when we were talking with the chair about how we prioritize complaints that did come in, one of the considerations was certainly whether there was repeat complaints at a location. So say we issued a violation for one location and there continued to be complaints, that would continue to sort of never-ending fire hose of complaints that came in. We would look at is there continued complaints at that location? That was one of the considerations for another inspection. But we did not, to be candid, we did not do itemized follow-up at every single location because that was not the resources available at the time. The circumstances did not allow for it. But whether a location had multiple, sorry, you can go ahead, Councilman. I apologize.
The point I'm making here is look, I've experienced it. I've made the complaints about a pharmacy and a supermarket. I'm talking about big chains that had multiple complaints and violations, and there was never any follow-up after there was a violation, and they kept doing it over and over again. So that's why I'm asking the question whether or not, there was follow-up that would lead to you as an agency to say, well, I got 100 complaints coming in here to a specific, Walgreens or a bodega here on Corona Avenue. What was the follow-up to that? Because my concern is that's what I'm trying to get at. I just need to know where you guys drew the line here. If you're telling me it was at oath, then it explains to me why there was businesses in communities like mine that continued to do that even after they were issued a violation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, certainly. So there's two possible scenarios. Yes, it would still go to oath. We can lock up a business. We don't have that authority to lock it up. So I know that it can continue to happen. So if we did get multiple complaints, and this is just across the board with any of the areas of our jurisdiction, that is a consideration. It does happen. I can't tell you right now how many times it happens specifically for price gouging. If you do have also like a specific business in your district, please by all means let us know, and we can always look specifically into that. It happens. We don't like it when it happens. We try to be effective. At least with price gouging, we think we were effective just by looking at the numbers.
I know you keep saying you're very effective by the numbers. We got that. That has been what you have said throughout this entire testimony. And I understand that, and I get that this was something that was being developed as it was happening. I just want to know just if there was actually any protocols that you had in place for businesses that were getting multiple complaints and continuing to price gouge in the communities that were most affected by it. That's my question. So if you're saying that you would end it at oath sometimes, or you would, it depended on availability of inspectors, okay, I just need to know what that was. And is that something that you as an agency have in place regardless of price gouging, but in any scenarios where there is multiple complaints that come in, you issue a violation, does it end there? That's what I'm trying to get at.
I don't think there's a black and white, because I think it's going to depend on the circumstance of the business.
What's the circumstance that leads you then to say there's a follow-up?
Well, we're going to have to look at how many complaints are coming in what period of time, to decide whether it warrants going back to the business to inspect it again.
So there is nothing in place right now that you as an agency have where you deem if a store or a business has over 10 complaints and it doesn't warrant you going to do a follow-up inspection after that, after they've been issued a violation.
Mm-hmm. I understand.
So in terms of a specific business, there is not a specific protocol there. But in general, what we do to inhibit recidivist activity and educate businesses that may be doing the same thing over and over again, that may be unlawful but unbeknownst to them, what we do is, for example, a couple of different things. One is we rely, of course, with bids and their data and our sister agencies to visit certain corridors specifically to educate those businesses in those areas that may have a higher complaint data that we receive or violation data that we receive as an agency. I can tell you in different areas of our work, certainly not related to price gouging in this instance, but in terms of how we develop outreach campaigns and our general outreach prerogatives, we do, for example, as recently as our paid safe and sick leave law as it relates to COVID-19 amendments that the council passed, we affirmatively contracted with vendors to reach out to industries that have a history of recidivism or issues with paid safe and sick leave so they wouldn't fall under the same issues in the future.
I got that. Look, I went out on the streets with you guys to do the same educational, walkthroughs that we did with the businesses. My thing is, what I'm getting from you is that there is actually nothing in place right now that you have as an agency that says, that this deems a follow-up to a business that may be in violation, whether it's price gouging or anything else. That's what I'm getting from this.
Well, I don't think we can say it.
I'm sorry. If I'm mistaken, please. I just want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly. That's what
of course, and we want to have obviously a productive dialogue here going forward. I mean, I think it's true that we do not have a black and white standard that says after X amount of violations of any law that we are going to go out again. But both in terms of the price gouging enforcement, even at the height of the pandemic and the price gouging complaints we were getting, and more generally, is a case-by-case analysis. So with the price gouging, as I mentioned before, if we got multiple complaints at a location, we would go out. And that would be true whether we already issued a violation at the location or not. So if a place we sent out an inspection, we spent an inspector, violations were issued, and we continue to get complaints, that naturally would lead to that location being prioritized in the regular course. I can't speak to every single instance, but as a general matter, that's our protocol. Similarly, with any of the laws we enforce, we are conscious of whether someone is taking advantage of the situation they're in, taking advantage in a predatory, in engaging in predatory conduct. So we will look on a case-by-case basis, on a law-by-law basis, because it really does matter whether we're talking about signage violations or we're talking about something that's more predatory towards consumers, how quickly we will respond, and how emergent the situation is. So I'm just saying that it is true that there's no across-the-board protocol, but this is something that informs our enforcement across all our categories.
Right, but this is the reason why I asked you, how many enforcement agents do you have? Because whether it's been getting the enforcement agency to come out to deal with street vendors, whether it's been to go out and deal with cars being sold out on the street, I always get the same thing. We don't have enough of enforcement agents to take care of the problem that we face here. So the more responsibility that gets shifted to consumer and worker protection, there isn't the investment that is made in ensuring that you have the adequate staffing to actually enforce the law. Or else what happens is then we have to get the NYPD or other agencies to fill that role in. And it's been a frustration for me for the number of years trying to really cure some of the quality of life issues that we faced in my district, because there has not been the ability to do any type of follow-up. And so the problem still will exist. And while I understand, you did a good job in lowering the numbers and how that was happening as it unrolled, I'm looking at this from a much bigger picture here as the agency itself, because who knows if we have another wave, but who knows what the next thing is. So my question is, the question really was about, do you have enough staffing? If you do, then okay, then what are the protocols for the follow-up? Because some of us on the ground don't see any follow-up afterwards. So that is why I'm leading to this question. And I don't mean to be argumentative here. I'm just trying to get to the solution that helps communities like mine that really need the agency to be present to help us with a lot of the issues that we face. I don't want to keep belaboring the issue anymore, because I know my colleagues have questions and they've been waiting. I just have two more questions on this particular topic, and I would love to follow up with you on this after as well, and maybe we can talk a little bit of strategy from there. But just how did you close the loop with the consumers who actually filed the complaint?
Well, the vast majority of complaints that we received at the height of the pandemic were mostly about alerting us that there was price gouging, as opposed to different types of complaints that we get about, like, I want my money back because I've been taken advantage of. It was mostly about just putting us on notice. So unlike when maybe some of our other categories that we enforce against, where we really have to have a long-term sort of back and forth with the consumer to get what they need. That's why we have a mediation unit in our consumer services unit. Here, it was much more about putting us on notice that there was a problem in the community. So we didn't have as much of a sort of back and forth and notice system with the individual consumers as we would in other situations.
So if I filed the complaint through 311 and then I went back to review it, would then the person be able to see, okay, the case was closed, or it would have information there at least?
Right. There would be some sort of notice that an inspection was sent out.
Got it. Okay. And lastly, how many of those complaints that were done after the 30 days resulted in no action? I know you guys said that you had a lot in the beginning, that you handled it within the first 28 days, but those that fell beyond that, how many of those?
I don't have the specifics on that, like specifically like after the 30 days. You mean the ones that came after 30 days?
No, the ones that like weren't like after 30 days that were not inspected. What happened? How many of those resulted in no action whatsoever?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have that, those specifics here, but
Okay.
we know you're interested, so we're gonna get that. I know that there were some other, more detailed number from Chair Velasquez as well, so we'll definitely wanna get those.
Thank you. I appreciate your time and thank you for taking my questions. Thank you, Chair Velasquez. Let me turn it back over to you.
I wanted to highlight certain other aspects that we wanted to go back to when we're talking about consumer needs changing during the pandemic, and certain stores that began to double and triple the price of at-home COVID tests. How many of these complaints did DCWP receive for price gouging related specifically for COVID self-tests?
For the at-home test, so that actually came right during the
Yeah, we actually have that number, just if you just give us one moment.
Okay. With the Omicron variant, that was something that came after like our initial influx. Give me the information, Chair. We had 194 of those.
Okay. And what was the follow-up?
Is that?
Yeah, you want me to take?
Yeah, go ahead, because that was the coordination we did, right?
So this is throughout the pandemic, we coordinated quite a bit with the Consumer Protection Fraud Bureau of the New York State Attorney General Office. They have their own price gouging law that is framed a little bit differently. They have certain powers we don't. We have certain powers they don't. They have certain products covered that we don't, and vice versa. So it was very important for us to collaborate. The at-home testing kits were one of the circumstances where it fit more squarely into their law. I can get into detail as much as you would like about sort of what that means and why it is. But the important point, I think, at a top line is that we had this ongoing collaboration. And so we set up a system where any at-home testing complaint that came into our agency, we made sure that the Attorney General got and that they acted on quickly, because we have jurisdiction over the same group of consumers. So from our perspective, what was most important is making sure that the consumers were not harmed and that there was enforcement against price gouging as expeditiously as possible.
Can you go a little bit further as to how you do collaborate with the AG's office and what they do have powers to oversee, and like where does DCWP differ?
Sure. I mean, throughout, from right at the very beginning, we had discussions with the Attorney General Office about what they were doing and what sort of enforcement steps they were taking on price gouging, and that's continued throughout the pandemic. And the sort of at-home testing kit was just the latest example during the Omicron surge. But earlier in the pandemic is another good example. I recall when I was sort of laying out the chronology of events that when we passed our emergency rule, so for the first like 4 months of the pandemic or so, it was limited to products and services regarding the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of COVID-19. So that didn't include food. And yet we were getting price gouging complaints about food, but we were circumscribed in what we could do about it at that point. The Attorney General already had, under the general business law, I believe 396-R, that for price gouging had a much broader law that was already on the books. In some ways, it's broader in a bad way because we actually had sort of we narrowed in on like what could constitute a violation. That I think was very helpful for our enforcement, but they could cover food. And so we got a lot of complaints about eggs, for example. And when we got those complaints, we collaborated with them, made sure that they got the complaints, followed up with them to see what they were doing. And so we could tell people on the ground what we were doing with price gouging. So those are just two examples, one towards the beginning of the pandemic, one towards the end of the pandemic, of how we collaborated with the AG.
Now, did you receive any complaints in regards to the pop-up testing sites that were falsely advertising 24 to 48-hour turnaround times on COVID tests?
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know if we have this.
I don't know if we have the exact numbers. We did get a handful of complaints, but serendipitously, so to speak, when we were engaging with the Attorney General's office about the at-home testing kit issue, was around the same time because it was all part of the Omicron surge. The testing site and whether the testing sites were sufficiently satisfying their representations about turnaround time, that was an issue that was coming right then, and we were in discussions about the at-home testing kits, and so the AG let us know, you know what, momentarily we're going to send out a public warning letter about this. And so through that collaboration, we knew, okay, the consumers there's an enforcement agency who is handling that issue right now. And after the Attorney General sent out those warning letters, there was a decline in the number of complaints we received about that issue. So that collaboration, again, continued to be effective. I'm sorry, that was a little bit all over the place. Did that make sense, Chair?
It made sense to me. Look, for me, it was an interesting world, right? And that was like late last year, early this year, where this was crucial, right? This moment was crucial for our communities. And I know certainly Councilmember Menon also did a lot of work on this. And that's why we're bringing this up, right? Because it affects all of us. And so we need to know, how do we advocate on our end for our communities? And also, what's the follow-up, right? What's the expectation? I call this in, for this 24, 48-hour pop-up testing site, it's affecting me every single day, because now I have to get me and my kid tested. And what should I do now that this has happened? So I guess from the consumer end, how did you, going back to what Councilmember Moya said, how did you alert the consumers? And from the business aspect, how did we follow up with those businesses? Did we issue violations, fines, besides what the AG did with issuing the letter?
No, we thought that, I'm sorry. No, we thought the best first step was to see how the EG's public action would play out. And it seems like it did have a salutary effect on the situation. So that was like, if we had continued to get complaints and we saw that the AG's action was insufficient, that was definitely something we were primed to work on in a much more proactive way.
And to Mike's point, we have not received any complaints since February 15th on this issue. So that strategic action has borne out to be the right one.
What kind of next steps would have been more appropriate if it wasn't effective? Where did you see it going next? And how can we make these businesses more accountable going forward?
I think we would have engaged again with the AGs, obviously, what the next steps they would have taken as far as flouting those warning letters, and we would strategize whether it made sense to take a dual approach between the two regulators to hit different groups. What happened with price gouging is there was more than enough for everyone to work on. There were more than enough businesses, more than enough products that were being price gouged. There was a role for multiple regulators. But as an enforcement agency, we always want to think strategically about the use of resources. And we will always think, all right, is this a place where there's space for us to work on, where we either should take the lead or we should do something in collaboration? So I think that would have been the next step if we had continued to see a sufficient number of complaints on that specific issue.
Got it. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and recognize Councilmember Farias, who just joined us, but I wanted to turn it to questions. So Councilmember Menon.
Thank you so much, Chair. I think this is such an important hearing, and I really want to thank you for holding this important hearing. Hello, Commissioner. I have so many questions. I don't even know where to begin, but I'm going to start with a deep concern I have about what I'm hearing today. What I'm hearing today is that the agency is saying that they're learning while flying the plane, and all sorts of comments basically suggesting that you all don't have the legal authority to go after price gouging to begin with without the commissioner promulgating these rules. I can't strongly enough disagree with that assertion, and I'd like you to provide to this committee your reasons why. I have to say, as someone who not only served as commissioner of this agency, I also served as executive assistant corp counsel at the city law department, and I'm looking right now at the consumer protection law, which clearly prohibits deceptive and unconscionable trade practices. I guess, why did you feel that the agency needed to keep promulgating these rules? Because my concern is that there's clearly was a delay in the inspections. You heard it from the chair, you heard it from the questioning by Councilmember Moya, and I just think it's unacceptable. And I also dispute your characterization of the controller's audit as routine. There's nothing routine in the controller's audit. I think we've all read through this audit. It's really troubling. And I'm concerned about the fact that COVID, we're going to have additional variants. How is the agency then going to be prepared to deal with it? So if you could please go through. I have many more questions, but that's sort of the beginning.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for those questions. Glad to hear that you don't agree with our assessment, but I am confident that our legal analysis is sound, and in collaboration with the law department, we wouldn't do something that they wouldn't agree with us. So we understood our limitations to begin with the law that dictated that we could indicate certain items to be in short supply, and then understood the limitations of that to then expand to issue an emergency rule, understand the limitations of that with a time frame to then quickly work to make it a permanent rule. There's absolutely nothing in the books as we understand it, but happy to hear where you might disagree with specifics on where the law allowed us to. I know what you meant generally, allowed us to move in terms of price gouging. So we're definitely comfortable with that. We, in terms of the amount of time that took with the complaints, it's tens of thousands of complaints all at one time in a period of 2 months. We had like over, close to 10,000 in a period of 2 months. And nobody could have predicted this. I think now that we understand better what a pandemic, assuming it's, similar, because I don't think we can also predict the details of what it would bring, we have a process in place that we wouldn't have to spend the time in setting up, right, the short supply list or moving to emergency rule or none of that. We do have a rule that we made it as expansive as possible so that we can now go back to it and put it into effect. And again, there's a lot of complaints. We now know better also to continue improving our education of the consumer so that they know how to give us all the information that is necessary. We do think we were impactful. Could we have gone more out? I think there's a lot more of anything that we can always do. I can't really sit here and tell you there's no more that we can do, because there will always be more that we can do. But, now that we have everything in place, the things that we think we have the tools necessary in place for any other emergency that may come our way. But if, again, we do like the collaboration, and I know that you serve in these roles, so you might obviously have like certain firsthand knowledge and experience that you think will be helpful for us as we prepare for anything that may come in the future.
Absolutely, Chair. If I can suggest, I do think that the agency should provide this committee with a legal memo as to why they believe that the current city's consumer protection law does not fully cover price gouging. Because again, we don't want to have a situation where there are new variants of COVID or something else. I really do want to understand that. Secondly, the controller's report shows that 45% of businesses where there was a complaint received no inspection. Why was that?
Thank you, Chairperson. Were you going to add something, Mike?
I know there are a couple of questions on the table now, but I just want to circle back maybe to the first question. And we will obviously provide whatever legal analysis you would like. Of course, we always are responsive to the council's questions. But I do want to stress that we took the action that we did in those months in February, March, in very close consultation with the Corporation Council, the New York City Law Department. So I assure you that we did what we thought was best legally and possible legally at the direction and with consultation with the Law Department, where we had a constructive back and forth about what the limits were on our legal jurisdiction. Because I do want to point out there are two parts of the CPL, the Consumer Protection Law. There's the prohibition on deceptive conduct, and there's the prohibition on unconscionable conduct. And the unconscionable conduct is what price gouging is here. It's not deceptive. They're telling you how much they're charging, but the fact is that's unconscionable. And under the terms of the Consumer Protection Law, even after amended with the help of the council last year, still requires that any unconscionable act be detailed by rule or regulation by the commissioner. So we can't just issue violations and call something unconscionable. There has to be notice to the businesses for unconscionable conduct. That's why there has to be a rule specifically about price gouging. There wasn't a price gouging rule other than the short supply rule that we described earlier. And why was it limited to certain products? Because again, in consultation with the law department, it had to be limited because it was going through an emergency exception to the City Administrative Procedure Act process, the CAPA process. And there was no chance for notice and comment. It had to be limited under certain requirements of the law. So that's why it was limited in the product.
I'm not going to belabor this. I would like for you all to please provide to the committee, if the chair agrees,
Sure.
a legal analysis and also talk about past actions the agency has taken against price gouging, because the agency has taken actions against price gouging before. So I'd like to see that. But I do want to, if I still have time, ask about what the chair asked about COVID pop-up sites. This is so important. I have introduced a bill into the council on this. My office is flooded with complaints about COVID pop-up sites. So did I hear correctly that you did not send out inspectors to COVID pop-up sites, or did you?
No, we did not, because we worked in collaboration with the Attorney General's office, and we understood that they were being effective in their addressing that issue.
Okay, I would, respectfully again say that the agency should be sending out inspectors. The Attorney General's office, and I've been referring matters to the Attorney General's office as well, but it is within your purview to look at these sites. And right now, these sites are still proliferating and deceiving consumers. So what
Yes.
is the plan on that?
So, Council Member, I appreciate the concern you're raising, and we'll definitely follow up with you about specific instances and specific, inspection requests or complaints that you're referring to. What the Commissioner and our Deputy General Counsel had detailed earlier is that we saw that the Attorney General's office was taking strategic steps to help mitigate an issue that was emerging. Since February, we have received 0 complaints on this issue. So we want to work with you, and happy to follow up offline
The reason you have 0 complaints is because 311 doesn't have it as a category. That's what my bill addresses. Basically, if you call 311 and you say there's a COVID pop-up site that said that I'm going to get results and I never got them, you can't report it to 311. That's the whole problem.
So we're happy to follow up with you offline and kind of bridge the gap here.
Okay, I have more questions, Chair, in the second round, but I'll stop now for now. Thank you so much.
Councilmember Brewer, then Councilmember Botter.
Thank you very much, Chair and Consumer Affairs. My line of questioning is the same. I was trained by Mark Green, who when he was public advocate, and I think what's missing, I just wanted to understand, with your 63 inspectors, I wanted to know, based on either the PEG or vacancies, whether you have vacancies, whether you have new needs, whether the PEG is going to hinder any of those no needs or any of the vacancies being filled. It's my understanding from talking to many of your colleagues, commissioners, that it's really hard to fill a lot of these slots now, because the challenge is proactive consumer affairs. So if you could just answer PEG, vacancies, number, and then I have some more questions just about the inspectors.
Okay. Thank you, Council Member. I can tell you right now that, for example, in enforcement, we do have a 93 active head count. That's where the 63 I was talking about. But in general, in that division, we have 12 vacancies.
Okay. And are you able to fill them? You're trying to fill them? What's the status?
We are trying to fill them. I don't think we've had issues in this area filling those vacancies.
Okay, so you don't know why you have them. It's just you're going to get them filled. All right, then the next question. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I don't know exactly all the details of each of the vacancies, where they came from.
The reason I ask is it's my impression, obviously COVID, but there'll be other topics that come up. I don't have a car, but I know that gas prices are high for whatever reason. It has something to do with international affairs. And there'll be other shortages of product, because we have an international and local challenge in terms of the chain that brings products to our country and our city. So in addition to all the COVID related, God help us if there's another one, what are you doing to be proactive about these issues? I mean, this is not COVID related, but I do worry that we're not going to Councilmember Moya or my district, anybody's district, to check on prices. I'm very neurotic about it. I look to see what the prices are and to see if there is, a lot of these drugstores now understandably are covering them with, you need a key to get in because of the shoplifting issues. It's really hard to know the prices. So my question is, of this current 63, hopefully another 12, great to have 93 total, how many are in the proactive world of stopping price gouging or anything else? How do you break that up? So sort of to do that proactive, Councilmember Menon was talking about for the pop-ups, but there, goodness knows, so many others that need proactive support in terms of stopping it before it starts.
Sure. Well, certainly when businesses start up, that's part of our visit and inspector program, that we do try to get out there very early on as they're opening up, so we can make sure that they know, the businesses know exactly what they're supposed to be complying with. So we do that. And then we also have our business education days that we get out there purposely with that sole purpose of the goal of educating and try to provide as much information as possible. So that is the proactive piece in terms of our enforcement. On the price gouging or the prices that may be going higher and higher, certainly the price gouging piece that falls under our jurisdiction, it has to be tied to a state of emergency. So if that were the case for future ones, for example, we would certainly make sure that we review it to make sure that find if the increase in the price is a business's attempt to exploit a current state of emergency, because that is the purpose of that law.
And we respond to price gouging by complaint and on patrol. So it's not just, our reactive complaint process.
Okay, but it's mostly a complaint-driven process, I believe. That's mostly how the city of New York operates for my 40 years. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, it's my impression that one of the reasons we're in this mess, and we've got inflation, we've got new emergencies that are going to be evident as time goes on. I'm just wondering, I would agree with Councilmember Menon that you have to be more proactive so that the city residents feel that their government is looking out for them. And I have to say, I don't feel, and this isn't just you, this is under de Blasio also. Like I said, I was trained by Mark Green, who was very proactive on consumer affairs, former consumer affairs commissioner. He did understand it. And you have to be with press conferences and constantly reminding. Dry cleaning, I can tell you probably there's a lot of dry cleaning issues right now, which is not COVID related. So what I'm saying is, with your inspectors, I do think that, and do you have like a plan to be more proactive about some of these issues that are I would say that the gas prices to a large extent are something that could be a challenge, because I have a feeling that people are going to take advantage of whatever's going on internationally. I really want to hear a little bit more about your proactive approach, as opposed to just those businesses that are starting up, or complaint driven, or education.
Well, we are going to be tracking, which we do already, tracking where there might be issues. I mean, going to the previous point on zip codes, which I know we didn't have specific here, those numbers for price gouging, but we certainly do look at trends. When things are coming in, we're going to be looking at where is it happening the most. I don't think it's realistic to say we'll ever get rid of everything. I mean, we'll stop existing, which will be great if we got to that. But I do think we try to be effective in trying to send a message and impact the businesses to understand what they need to comply with, and then the consumers to be educated. So we'll do a two-prong approach. I mean, the more places we get invited to in terms of the education piece, I think it's going to be the better, because I think we can all agree nobody's going to come to our website necessarily to look for information. We want to get out and give the information to the individuals where they are in the way they're going to best understand it. So we look at data to find out where there may be issues, so we can get out and proactively approach them. As Steve mentioned, if they are, we have our inspectors out and they are targeting something in particular, but they see another issue, they can address it at the same time. It's not like they're going to be blind to one aspect of the law that we cover. And we'll just continue tackling it. Open to ideas. If there is a specific program that we haven't, thought about, happy to build it. I mean, we definitely want to be more effective. We don't want to be a hamster wheel on enforcement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The only last question is, do you have new needs that you have requested from the budget?
We are working with OMB. I know that we have we did get our food delivery app additional positions so that we could, 24, right? We could implement those. So we always, we continue to work with them. We put some things on the blueprint, so to the extent that those result in new needs, we will be working with OMB to put in those asks so that we can turn those ideas into action.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think there's lots of work to be done.
Thank you. Now, Councilmember Bottcher.
Hello, Commissioner. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Thank you. As the mandates and restrictions continue to be lifted, there's a lot of concern among immunocompromised New Yorkers, New Yorkers with disabilities, and those with loved ones at high risk for COVID-19. As these restrictions are being lifted, how are the city's consumer protection policies taking into account the needs of these populations?
I'm sorry, I had a hard time hearing. There's a little bit of echo. With the change in that, you said as the restrictions are lifted, how are you
taking into account the needs of New Yorkers with disabilities, immunocompromised New Yorkers, people with loved ones at risk of COVID-19?
Okay, I think I understood you, but if not, please just interrupt me as I'm giving you an answer.
Yeah, in other words, how are you including the input of these populations as you craft policy going forward, this ever-changing policies? Restrictions are being lifted, mandates are being lifted. How are you including the input of these immunocompromised populations, people with disabilities, and others who continue to be at high risk?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Council Member. I mean, throughout the pandemic, we have to do a lot of shifting, and I don't think that has stopped or will stop. A lot of our entry points are certainly going to be through various stakeholders that are going to tell us, hey, you're not serving this population, this is how to reach them. Also through some sister agencies, for example, with the Mayor's Office of People with Disabilities, we've done certain work in specifically with our financial empowerment centers to make sure that counseling could happen also by phone, for example, if people don't want to go to a place in person. Perhaps before it was something that it was okay with COVID, like you mentioned, immunocompromised, that's going to be something even if restrictions are lifted, I'm still not going to be comfortable going to some place in person. So as we continue to open up services in person through our partners, especially the financial empowerment piece, we still continue. We're not dropping online or telephone services. So I would say that's one area where we look forward to continue to provide those services. And again, if there's any other ways that we haven't thought of, would love to hear them so that we can figure out the best way to reach them and not leave any particular group of people out of services we should be providing.
I think we could be seeing some unanticipated issues arise in this ever-changing situation. For example, what kind of compliance training or resources is being provided to small businesses that have shifted their layouts or their policies due to COVID? How could that impact the community of folks with disabilities? So it's great that this is on your radar and the priority of your agency.
Yes, and we do work together with SBS, so to the extent that it may make more sense for SBS to help certain businesses with certain policies to reach certain populations, that also help them be in compliance, not just with our laws, but just plain out better business and better services, we do that. So if it's something that, it might come through our attention, we'll still address our piece and collaborate with other sister agencies so that it's a holistic approach and not just addressing one issue but leaving another one unattended.
Yeah, and I do want to mention just, relatedly to our consumer protection work, within our Office of Financial Empowerment, we use and utilize our neighborhood financial health research to identify the most financially vulnerable neighborhoods, those that were impacted the most by COVID. Certainly there is a parallel there that includes reaching out to not only all demographics, but also I think you had mentioned specifically folks with disabilities, and we do have a partnership with the mayor's office in that case to ensure that their specific needs are being met and that there are wraparound services that we offer not only at DCWP but across our sister agencies to ensure that they're being seen and heard.
Thank you.
Okay, so we want to go into the second round of questioning. Just wanted to follow up something that was mentioned earlier about complaints, the inspections and complaints being followed up by either a phone call or on patrol. Can you explain to me what you meant by on patrol? How many inspectors are there on patrol, and how do you allocate those resources throughout the city?
So the 63, because I know CONSUMERPRO was also asking this total, right? So we have the 98 in enforcement, 93 headcount in enforcement, 63 are inspectors. They are out on the field. Every day of the week, we rotate, right, our staff to go address different industries and different areas. So it's all going to come down to what are we seeing, what are areas of priority during COVID, right? I mean, there's a lot of businesses who are shut down, so it didn't make sense to necessarily send certain inspectors to like certain brick and mortar businesses and whatever, we're not going to go somewhere if it's going to be closed. So it varies. Then we're going to look at the complaints that are coming in. What's the type of complaint? We're going to look at the data. We're going to look at the zip codes like we talked about. If there's issues that we want to address in a particular region, they certainly have their plans that they work. It's not, they don't just wake up one morning and say, oh, today seems like a good day to do this. We certainly have certain, based on the knowledge of the years of doing the enforcement in the areas that are covered by our jurisdiction, we're just going to look at that and create a plan for our inspectors to get out and be most effective in curbing any illegalities when it comes to our consumer protection law.
You also mentioned a measurement of trends. How do you go about that? And can you explain then the action item after you've measured these trends, and how do you communicate it not only to the consumers, but to the businesses themselves?
When did I say? I want to make sure I remember what I said. And you mean in terms of the data that we use to decide where we put our enforcement resources?
Yeah, it was right after it was while Councilmember Brewer was talking about not only inspectors, but certainly how we gauge what state looks like, what vacancies look like, and overall what the plan of action is, and how we could, advocate on your behalf, whether it is increasing staffing and funding for staffing or increasing other mechanisms like that.
I think it's similar to what I mentioned before for the previous answer, that we're going to be looking just, obviously like price gouging, right? That took front stage for us. So a lot of the resources were diverted to that and addressing that. If there's other industries and other areas that we see an increase in complaints coming in, that we're going to move towards that and figure out what's the most efficient way to get through the businesses. We're going to work with, chambers of commerce or the bids or, even our sister agency, SBS, when they're going in and doing their own work directly with the businesses. Just a multi-pronged approach to see what is the most effective way to communicate the compliance, the need for compliance, and ideally, right, also understand what they need, helping them understand what's the impact of what they're doing and causing to the community, because after all, they are another member of the community by being there. So it's just going to be touching on the various points and all the tentacles that we can have as a city to impact our consumers and the businesses that are serving them. Yeah, and our response to trends manifests itself in different ways.
depending on what specific area of work you're looking at. As the commissioner mentioned, it could be responding to certain complaint data and where the zip code data is and having more strategic outreach in those areas with partners. But it also informs our work with our tax prep providers, for example, our financial empowerment centers. Just to use tax prep as an example, because we are in tax season right now, I do want to prop that up as a plug. But we identify site locations based on census data and services that the IRS provides. So that's like one area where our own data, the IRS's data, the census data is all used to kind of inform different locations, over 100 in the city right now. And that's in a specific area. But as the commissioner mentioned, that kind of work, that affirmative plan and mission that the commissioner has informs all of our offices and divisions' work.
Got it. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Councilmember Farias because she has not asked a question just yet. And then after that, Councilmember Menon.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Chair Velasquez. And pardon this question if it was already answered previously, because I did hop in a little late. I just wanted to get a better idea of how you folks were managing some of the price gouging happening throughout our different community pharmacies and stores on the different types of test kits that may have been distributed or within our communities. I don't know if I know exactly the monitoring or management of all of that in terms of complaints from constituencies, or even if it was just us checking in or setting a standard.
Thank you, Council Member. I think we might have touched on it in a different way, but the way we dealt with the complaints as they came in, we're looking at a number of factors to, look at. For example, do we have all the information that we need to get out there and inspect the business? And then if we saw a large number of complaints about a particular business, generally we're going to focus on that as well, getting out and into the most impacted communities. And also on the test kits, and there was a quite related question with pop-up sites working together with the Attorney General's office that has its own jurisdiction and its own mandate, and trying to, in collaboration, maximize our enforcement units to impact and get rid of the price gouging that was happening, especially during 2020.
Is there, and maybe I think this is maybe what Councilmember Menon was touching on a little bit, is there a legal way or a legal way to mandate some of the pricing on some of these test kits or units in our communities going forward? I imagine this is endemic, and so we will always at some form or shape have to have some sort of local testing and or ability for people to still test at home every winter or every spring, summer. So just wondering, from your side, do you see that as a plausibility or something that would be helpful?
We feel we have the tools in place. The price gouging rule, it is tied to a declaration of a state of emergency. So to the extent that that continues, then we can keep enforcing price gouging. And it has to be related, right? Is that the point of price gouging is making sure that businesses are not taking advantage of the state of emergency for consumers to reach and access certain products and services. So that is something that we feel we have the tools in place to continue addressing it. Like you mentioned, it's turning into an endemic. Is there anything, I want to make sure I'm not missing anything from the legal from your perspective, Mike, as a general counsel?
No, I think we'd have to see how things develop.
Okay, and my last, just a little follow-up. Have we seen in any complaints or cases that expiration dates have increased prices on some of the products, or if we're getting people selling expired COVID kits or anything like that?
We probably want to get back to you on that specific. I don't know if we have that data with us specifically related to expiration dates and how that's impacted pricing or that part.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Councilmember Menon.
Thank you. I just have two follow-up questions. For the 63 inspectors, could you just talk a little bit about what percentage of their time and how many of them were out working on price gouging?
During the height of the pandemic, we had at any one point 30 of them available to go out and do price gouging complaints. Week by week, it really, really varied because it just depended who wasn't sick, who wasn't subject to COVID themselves.
Okay.
There were also, I was just going to say, there were also, given the time and the fact that certain businesses were shuttered, we were able to shift staffing to that particular case. So that's not to say that we have 30 dedicated price gouging inspectors currently. That's more a function of what we were able to devote on the ground at any given moment, given the context of the pandemic.
And what about on the pop-up sites? One of the things, since you can't report a complaint to 311 currently, can the agency put something on the website that tells people how to, because you clearly say you haven't inspected any of these pop-up sites, which I find very troubling. So in order to rectify that, since a lot of people don't know to contact the state AG's office, the agency should have something on the website that makes it clear how you can file a complaint, and that way
Absolutely.
Your inspectors follow up.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. That is exactly, very direct suggestion, and we'll be happy to definitely put something out that addresses that concern. I'm sorry that's the reason why we haven't received any complaints, but absolutely we'll be happy to put the information on our website or whichever other way you think may be efficient and effective to get the word out and educating our consumers so their complaints can be addressed.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioner.
I'll now turn it back to our moderator, Stephanie Jones.
Thank you, Chair. We will now turn to public testimony, in which we will be calling on Deputy City Comptroller Maura Hayes Chaffee to testify. Council members who have questions for the Deputy Comptroller should use the raise hand function in Zoom, and I will call on you after she has completed her testimony. Deputy Comptroller?
Yes, good morning or afternoon.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you to Chair Velasquez and the entire Consumer and Worker Protection Committee for the opportunity to submit testimony on behalf of the New York City Comptroller, Brad Lander. The Comptroller's Office audited the New York City Department of Consumer and Worker Protection to determine whether the agency had established proper procedures and internal controls to ensure compliance with the emergency rule it instituted to address price gouging during a declared state of emergency. We perform such audits to ensure that agencies operate in accordance with their procedures and in the best interest of the public. By way of background, in March 2020, DCWP promulgated an emergency rule pursuant to its charter authority and the administrative code, declaring it as unconscionable the practice of price gouging for any personal or household good or service that is needed to prevent or limit the spread of or treat COVID-19. Our audit scope period covered March 4, 2020 to November 16, 2020. The audit was designed to look at the procedures and internal controls DCWP had established to handle the influx of complaints that were coming in from New York City residents about price gouging. Our office found that in this case, DCWP had established procedures and implemented internal controls to help ensure compliance with the emergency rule it instituted to address price gouging. However, we identified several operational limitations that should be remedied. Specifically, the agency had not formalized written procedures for how the General Counsel Division should prioritize price gouging complaints for inspection, nor had the agency established an independent review process for the priority determinations made. As a result, DCWP's ability to ensure that the General Counsel's priority determinations consistently aligned with established protocols was limited. In addition, DCWP had not established productivity measures, including timeliness standards, for its inspections in response to price gouging complaints. We found that DCWP conducted inspections in response to approximately 28% of the price gouging complaints it received, and that those inspections occurred on average 43 days after the complaints were received, and in 16% of the cases, more than 90 days after receipt. Without time targets or other productivity measures, DCWP's ability to ensure that complaints are addressed as soon as is feasible and without unnecessary delays is diminished. Based on the audit, we made 4 recommendations. DCWP should memorialize in writing its criteria for enforcement of the price gouging rule. DCWP should establish an independent review process for its complaint selection determinations. DCWP should establish criteria for how often businesses with multiple complaints should be inspected. And DCWP should establish and monitor performance measures with specified timeframes for resolving price gouging complaints through timely inspections and follow-up action, and ensure that they are documented in writing and complied with. While DCWP ultimately accepted the audit team's recommendations, we expect them to be implemented in a timely way to better arm New York City with the tools needed to protect consumers in moments of emergency. Though we appreciate the enormous challenges agency faced while responding to the pandemic, we want to see the city take these hard lessons, earned lessons of the last 2 years to improve its overall preparedness for future emergencies. Thank you once again, Chair Velasquez, for the opportunity to testify this morning and for your attention to this matter.
Thank you, Deputy, for coming in, sharing the audit with us. Definitely.
Thank you. I think you're muted, Chair. Thank you.
I think it's that I unmute myself and then it's muted. It is what it is. We're still working in the Zoom world, and you know.
Absolutely.
There's that tech challenge I have. Thank you. Thank you so much for presenting. I know that this has not been easy for DCWP, but it has not been easy for our communities, and that's what we're fighting for. And so this audit is very important to us as to how we prepare for the future, and certainly how do we hold not only the agency accountable, but ourselves accountable, and how we can all work to bring us back to whole as best as possible. So with that, I had a couple of questions, and I'm sure my colleagues do as well. I think it's what lessons the agency should learn from the audit.
Well, I think the recommendations that were noted in the audit are important lessons. And as you have heard and as reflected in the report, the agency agreed to adopt those recommendations and to make changes. So I think that's an important change, and hopefully that will stand us all in good stead moving forward. I think in its response to the audit, the agency also noted the lack of resources in some cases. And I think that is something, you know, while we would defer to the agency as to what resources it needs, the fact is that the volume of complaints markedly increased immediately during the pandemic. Yeah.
Is it your sense that the office was surprised by the number of complaints that were submitted by city residents?
I don't think surprise is the correct characterization. You know, it was immediate. However, the increase was roughly 114% over the prior year. So that's a very big jump to cope with for any agency.
Do you think beyond further resource like a staffing would be helpful? And I know we've discussed written protocols going forward. Any other recommendations at this point?
just what's noted in the audit itself. You know, we focused on the absence of timeliness standards. We also recommended an independent review to assess the quality and to ensure consistency of the determinations that were made. And I think that's advisable. I think the other recommendation that was highlighted was actual policy around how frequently businesses that were complained about more than once were visited. And I think that's also an important recommendation.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it now to my colleagues who may have questions. Doesn't look like they do. I'm going to turn it now to my committee counsel, Stephanie Jones.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your testimony, Deputy Comptroller.
My pleasure.
Thank you. This concludes the public testimony portion of the hearing. If we have inadvertently missed a member of the public who is registered to testify today and has yet to be called, please use the Zoom raise hand function and you will be called on in the order that your hand was raised. Seeing no hands raised, I will now turn it over to Chair Velasquez to offer her closing remarks. Chair.
I want to thank the committee for showing up today and my colleagues for bringing about very serious questions to DCWP that had a very difficult decision and a difficult time period for all of us New Yorkers. And what we have seen is when we work together, we bring our bright minds together, we can be more effective. And I'm looking forward to incorporating the changes and the audit that the controller provided us to make sure that our communities, the most vulnerable, are protected. And I'm looking forward to implementing changes as needed and look forward to working together with all our AG, our controller, and certainly my great colleagues who have shown up today to bring effect better changes for all. So thank you all and looking forward to making the next steps real. Have a blessed day.